Welcome to Unit 4, Lesson 4. Causes of the Revolution. The Boston Tea Party. Sit-ins, marches, posters, and chants are the tools of peaceful protest. They help people express displeasure or opposition without violence. The colonists were angry with the British, but sometimes they found ways to make their feelings known without lifting a weapon. The main idea for today's video is when Parliament imposed new laws to regulate tea, colonists responded by throwing a cargo of British tea into Boston Harbor. New law, old tax. At about the same time as the Boston Massacre, the British government decided to repeal most of the Townshend Acts. The taxes on all of the items listed in the act were lifted, except for the tax on tea. There were fewer protests, and for 2 years the relationship between Britain and the colonists were generally calm. But in 1772, patriots in Rhode Island burned a British ship that had been searching local boats for smugglers. When news of the attack reached England, Parliament once again began passing laws to gain greater control over the colonies. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams responded by forming a committee of correspondence. This group made a list of British offenses against the colony's rights and published it in Massachusetts. Other colonies joined in the movement by forming their own committees. The committee soon had a new complaint. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies. This lowered the price of tea, but it also took money away from the colonial tea merchants. The Prime Minister also refused to repeal the Townshend Acts on tea. Despite the fact that cheaper tea would now be available, the new law fanned the flames of the colonial resentment toward Britain. Colonial tea merchants were close to going out of business, and Parliament was still taxing the colonists without representation. Tea overboard. At first, the colonists protested by making it difficult for the British East India Company to deliver shipments of tea. Workers in major cities refused to unload shipments of tea from ships in ports. In New York and Philadelphia, the ship's captains were told to return to England. On the night of December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans and boarded 3 ships loaded with tea in the Boston Harbor. Without harming the ship's other cargo, they dumped the tea into the icy water, while thousands of people on shore watched the events of the Boston Tea Party unfold. The Boston Tea Party was not the only act of colonial defiance that involved tea. In October 14, 1774, in Annapolis, Maryland, a ship with a cargo of tea was set on fire. King George was furious. Soon Parliament would enact new laws to punish the colonists for their actions, and the stage would be set for further conflicts.
You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party. Something about a bunch of angry colonists dressed as Native Americans throwing chests of tea into the water. But the story is far more complicated, full of imperial intrigue, corporate crisis, smuggling, and the grassroots origins of the American Revolution. The first thing you need to know about tea in the 1700s is that it was really popular. In England, each man, woman, and child consumed almost 300 cups of the stuff every year. And, since the English colonized America, Americans were crazy about tea too. By the 1760s, they were drinking over 1 million pounds of tea every year. So, when Britain wanted to increase taxes on tea in America, people were not happy, mostly because they had no say in tax decisions made in London. Remember that famous phrase, no taxation without representation? The American colonists had long believed that they were not subject to taxes imposed by legislature in which they lacked representation. In fact, rather than paying the taxes, they simply dodged the tax collectors. Since the east coast of America is hundreds of miles long and British enforcement was lax, about 3/4 of the tea Americans were drinking was smuggled in, usually from Holland. But the British insisted that Parliament did have the authority to tax the colonists, especially after Britain went deeply into debt fighting the French in the 7 Years' War. To close the budget gap, London looked to Americans, and in 1767 imposed new taxes on a variety of imports, including the Americans' beloved tea. America's response? No thanks. They boycotted the importation of tea from Britain, and instead brewed their own. After a new bunch of British customs commissioners cried to London for troops to help with tax enforcement, things got so heated that the Redcoats fired on a mob in Boston, killing several people in what was soon called the Boston Massacre. Under the terms of the 1773 Tea Act, Parliament cooked up a new strategy. Now the East India Company would sell the surplus tea directly through hand-picked consignees in America. This would lower the price to consumers, making British tea competitive with the smuggled variety while retaining some of the taxes. But the colonists saw through the British ploy and cried, "Monopoly!" Now it's a cold and rainy December 16, 1773. About 5,000 Bostonians are crowded into the Old South Meeting House, waiting to hear whether new shipments of tea that have arrived down the harbor will be unloaded for sale. When the captain of one of the ships reported that he could not leave with his cargo on board, Sam Adams rose to shout, "This meeting can do no more to save the country." Cries of "Boston Harbor a teapot tonight" rang out from the crowd, and about 50 men, some apparently dressed as Native Americans, marched down to Griffin's Wharf, stormed aboard 3 ships, and threw 340 tea chests overboard. An infuriated British government responded with the so-called Coercive Acts of 1774, which, among other things, closed the port of Boston until the locals compensated the East India Company for the tea. That never happened. Representatives of the colonies gathered at Philadelphia to consider how best to respond to continued British repression. This First Continental Congress supported destruction of the tea, pledged to support a continued boycott, and went home in late October 1774, even more united in their determination to protect their rights and liberties. The Boston Tea Party began a chain reaction that led with little pause to the Declaration of Independence and a bloody rebellion, after which the new nation was free to drink its tea, more or less, in peace.
Just a quick review. In 1772, Samuel Adams set up a committee of correspondence, which was a coordinated effort to list the grievances of the colonists. The Tea Act law was passed in 1773, designed to get more money from the colonists, and the Boston Tea Party was a colonial protest where the Sons of Liberty destroyed tea in the Boston Harbor. That's all for today's video.